All right, welcome everybody to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Take a minute, like the video, share it with your friends, get on social media, tell folks to come join in on this conversation. Um, Support us on Patreon, of course, if you appreciate the work that we do, or become a member. Shout out to Samira, who just became a member during our last live stream. Another housekeeping item, just there's a couple of more live streams coming up soon. So tomorrow we'll be talking again to Steven Salaita about his recent book, An Honest Living, which is above my that way. And then on Monday, we're going to be talking to Celeste Winston about her book, How to Lose the Hounds, which is about maroon geography. So, anyways, if you appreciate the work that we're doing, come, check those out as well. So today I have a couple of folks. So I'm going to briefly introduce them and say a couple of things about the conversation. Um, so just I guess to start, like we've talked a little bit about Aaron Bushnell. Obviously it's not surprising that he's come up in a couple of the different conversations that we've had recently, given all the discussion we've had on Palestine. And so we thought that we would do something a little bit lengthier, kind of thinking about Aaron, trying to honor, his act of self-immolation and what that means. Um, and also, we wanted to have a broader kind of conversation about honoring sacrifice, risk taking, things like this within um, the context of the United States where we are. Um, and so the first person that I thought of to do this with is one of our guests, Wendy Trevino, who's she's a poet. One of her books is also behind me, Cruel Fiction. Um, so I'll do the introductions. So Wendy is the author of Cruel Fiction and Brazilian is Not a Race. In case you didn't know, Brazilian is not a race. Her political home is with anarchists and anti-state communists. And Wendy said, I want to bring a friend, a comrade of mine, and that's Julius Ze, who is an anarchist living in New York City. There's another aspect of his bio that you all can read in the show notes. So anyways, I'm going to welcome them both to the stage for this conversation. So Wendy and Julius, welcome.
Hi. Hello.
Hi, welcome. All right. So just to start, why don't you each say a little bit more about yourself? Maybe a little bit also like why you wanted to come to this conversation, or a little bit about your political background, just to give folks a little bit of an idea. I mean, obviously, I didn't say it in the intro, but Aaron Bushnell also identified as an anarchist, right? And so I also wanted to have this conversation with some anarcho comrades. And so, yeah. So anyways, either one of you could start. Wendy, maybe you start since you're unmuted.
So I'm Wendy Trevino. I have been active in various political struggles, mostly in the Bay Area, for the past 13 years. I mean, for me, I say my political home is with anarchists and anti-state communists. It's very much that way. The Bay Area, and when I came into things, is a very specific context where a lot of anti-state communists and anarchists work together very closely for many years. And I was just somebody who went to a protest one day. It was an anti-police protest after someone had been killed. And, that's how I kind of just got started. And my first demo, I saw people that I knew actually, but I mean, I love them, but they weren't that friendly at the moment. But who was really friendly with me and completely just like calling me hun and sweetie and like including me, I didn't even know them, were all these queer people in Black that were anarchists, and I was there with like a camel colored cardigan and light jeans, and these people were all dressed in Black. I didn't know what the hell I was doing, but they were so fucking friendly to me, can I say that word? By the way, I don't. Okay, but they were so
Yes,
friendly.
yes.
Okay, but they were so friendly, and that just continued for a really, and it's going to this day, you know. And when um, the people I've been most comfortable around have identified that way. And you know, because I came in and I like Marx, it's been it's been like a little tricky, but I like my home is with anarchists and anarchists who accept and love anti-state communists.
Right on. Julius, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I am also a long-term anarchist. I lived in the Bay Area for a very long time. Um, I'm a millennial, which is to say that I've been in the mix doing this for the better part of the last 2 decades. My background is in insurrectionary anarchism. I definitely came up as a teenager in the queer anarchist ferment of the early 2000s. I was part of the Bashback Network, which, for listeners who aren't familiar, was a queer anarchist network primarily based in the Midwest. Um, in the Bay Area is where I met Wendy, who is one of my dearest comrades. And basically anything Wendy asked me to do, I'll do. So here I am. A lot of my focus has been, I've been a participant in every anti-police uprising that happened in the Bay Area over the last decade or so. I was there through the Occupy movement and the Oakland Commune, which is the context where Wendy and I met. And my focus over the last several years has definitely shifted more towards the spiritual and spiritual aspects of anarchism and what that means and what that looks like and what the implications of it are. And so I think there are things that I imagine why Wendy asked me to be here that relate to Aaron's sacrifice, and I'm excited to talk about it and get into it with y'all.
That's great. So thank you both for that backdrop. And so I'll just say a little bit, like Wendy, you and I think we're talking. I mean, we've been talking a little bit we're always talking a little bit, but we've been talking a little bit recently. And I think um, there's a whole context that I think I've been struggling with or thinking about a little bit. And it's interesting because I don't think there's like a sectarian division around this necessarily. What I'm going to get into, um, it's more, I think, you know, I'd like to theorize that it's part of living within empire, perhaps, or that it has to do with kind of Western epistemologies and secular, um, all these kind of things. But we've been having this discussion about, or I've been thinking about risk and about sacrifice and things like this, right? And there's a lot of risk aversion within the left these days in the United States, just broadly speaking, I would say. I think that's always been true to some degree, but I think it's much more than it has been in past decades. I really do. Um, and there's this term like we had Ed Mead on, rest in power, like a little while before he passed away, about a year before he passed away. And like he always had this term that he used, he would call the tamed left. Um, and his description of it was being in the Bay around the Iraq War protests and people being um, like policed by the folks who call the protests, right? Of like lighting a trash can on fire, and he would say, maybe if you let them light that trash can on fire, it would have gotten a little bit of media attention, like, I mean, not that media attention's all we're looking at, but his point was just sort of like that there was no coverage, broadly speaking, of those protests. A lot of people wouldn't know that they were happening unless they were there. Um, Often they happen on weekends, often the cities are empty, etc., right? And um, that there was such a discipline around transgressing the boundaries of legality all the time, that this really kept things very tame, to use his word, right? Um, And so I've been thinking about that, and like the consequences of that. And I've also been thinking about, how much of a commitment, for instance, if we talk about Palestinians, that there is to sacrifice, that there is to like recognizing people who make the ultimate sacrifice, right, including their lives, and honoring that, right. I think that's one of the key things is like the idea of honoring risk taking, the idea of honoring sacrifice, and like how important that is to struggles. Um, and so these were things we were already kind of thinking, or I was thinking about, and I was talking to you maybe a little bit about um, around the time when Aaron Bushnell, this, you know, radical act of self immolation, um, and so then it was interesting after that also to see how people responded to that too, right? So I'll just stop there, and let you all come in with, you know, how maybe your responses to what I've said, but also um to Aaron's act and the responses to Aaron's act.
um, well, I'll start. For me, I want to say like it was a process of discovery. Like uh, the second I think I saw maybe 30 minutes after news of Aaron Bushnell came up on a radical account on Twitter. And I just saw a picture. I saw a military person, looks like self-immolation. And I just didn't know what to think. So I started like reading the thread and I saw some important words, that they had quoted. And at this point, it's only 30 minutes into it appearing on, I think, that Talia Jane account or whatever. So there's not a lot of information. And but I did see these words, like genocide, and what else was available at that point? Genocide and um, there was some other no, I don't think colonizers was out yet, but maybe I'll just say genocide because that's what I remember right now. But that's a contested term right now, like not among my people, but among like some, like I think broadly speaking, that's a contested term. So I see somebody use that term and I already think, is this one of my people? And so that like set something up for me where I'm like, and then of course I turned to my partner Josh, and because I often go to him when I encounter something like this, and I'm like, is this big? He's like, it's huge, like and we don't know what it is yet, but it's huge, and then I like go to my friends and I like share this information, and we're basically like it's something that demands a lot of space, and why I say that is because we don't know what it is yet, but it is something, so there's a lot of I feel like a lot of people like have this way that when they talk about how they responded, there's giving no room for the fact that we didn't know what was actually going on, and that like trying to jump to conclusions about things is never like a great idea, especially with the information coming out on social media. Like you want to kind of start digging and see what you can find and be patient, but it's definitely something that demanded a lot of space. And I knew it was a political act because to me, so that's what self-immolation is. It's a political act. And given all the things that I've seen online, it's somebody making a political act in response to what a lot of the stuff I've been seeing on Twitter has been about for the last several months, so, and then other things that came to mind too, but we didn't know enough yet. This is before the actual film was released. And I thought too, like, well, we have, both Julius and I have had experience with anti-war vets and that were comrades if they weren't anarchists, they were around anarchists a lot. And I know about some of the things that they did while they were still enlisted and afterwards, including doing time in military prison to avoid deployment to Iraq. Like I know the level of seriousness that exists among military resisting military. and I know that it's very real, and yeah, so that's basically, the first thing. And then the video came out, and I started hearing more of the words, and I was like, there's analysis here, talking about colonizers. Like, again, this is contested on the left, about like settler colonialism, talking about this is what the ruling class, like I even texted a friend, when I found this language, and he was like, he said the ruling class. I was like, yeah. So like I'm hearing these words, and I'm like, there's analysis here. I don't know what this person is yet, but like, it's something. And then we start to see the last Facebook post with the Circle A, and then I like start seeing that, he was part of mutual aid projects in San Antonio. And forget it, when I saw San Antonio, like San Antonio, where I'm from, San Antonio is like the big city, and like there's a lot of back and forth between the Valley and San Antonio. I'm from the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. And, that's where we went every year to like either go shopping or to go, like to, I forget the name of the theme park, but like we would go vacation there. And my dad lived there for a year because a lot of people will get transferred out of the Valley to San Antonio, the first big city. So he lived there for a year when I was in high school. I had friends that moved from San Antonio to the Valley, friends that moved away from the Valley to San Antonio. It's about 4 hours from where I grew up, so that means a lot to me. And especially because for me, I have, my background involves a lot of people in the military, and also the concept of people coming from around the country to live in the RGV or San Antonio, and it being related to like military is not unfamiliar to me. There's even like a Marine military academy in the city I grew up in. I even went to like a dance for them, like when I was in junior high, because my friend was dating a quote cadet, like I mean, like that's very familiar to me. Military has such a strong presence down there. Most of my family has been in the military. Many of them work in border enforcement now, which I include as part of the military, honestly. And it's been really hard for me to like have the same relationship to home that I used to. And it's really hard for me because I was raised in a big family by a lot of people, not just by my parents, so that's been really difficult. So, but it also, since I started writing and talking more very publicly about radicalism, being against border enforcement, I have met people from Texas, but especially South Texas, who are doing the kind of like work that I try to do out here down there. And I know they're there. I wish I had found them, much sooner. But I know that they're there. So like imagining this young man, like meeting those people, like it just meant a lot to me. They're, most of the time, like it's very hard to believe certain kinds of things are possible. So I will say that what I was thinking and what I came to as like, I learned more and more was, damn, stuff is possible that maybe like this makes me feel like things are possible that I usually have a very hard time believing are possible.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I guess I want to approach the question from a slightly different angle, which obviously I was, when Wendy talks about these conversations that comrades were having and that we were all just kind of dumbstruck at first and slowly started to figure out what was going on. Like, I completely agree. I think that when someone does something so intense, there is a need to pause and really try to like understand and comprehend. I mean, it's an act that is designed, and from what we can tell, Aaron Bushnell was very thoughtful, very intelligent, like had a plan, had a strategy, thought about all the details. And so I think that in and of itself requires like demands that we pause and contemplate a little bit. And I definitely was there. And when I started thinking more about it, it was specifically about the idea of sacrifice, which you bring up in the first question, Jay. And for me, it's important to really like get to the root of the word sacrifice, right? Like etymologically, it comes from the concept of to make sacred, to make holy, right? So it's not just some, like, I think that in modern capitalism, like it's common for revolutionaries and radicals to always say like, oh, well, you know, we all make sacrifices to survive and whatever. And I don't think that we should start from that perspective, that it's just like, oh, it's a compromise, or it's something like it's in fact, it's something that we give up, but it's something we give up to make holy, right? It's something that we're carving out or designating, like in the sacrificial rituals that exist in most traditional cultures or like ancient um, civilizations. Sacrifice was something that you're giving up to the gods, right? It's something that we're cutting off from the rest of our lives. And I think that this idea of making holy or making sacred is really important to understanding both the context of, you know, the shaheeds or the martyrs within the Palestinian struggle, but also just it's something that the left, and specifically the secular left, is always going to stumble over because we don't have recourse to the holy within a secular framework, right? And I already, during some of the indigenous land defense struggles on this continent over the last decade, was starting to notice that there was this disconnect when anarchists or communists wanted to be in solidarity with those struggles. And part of the disconnect is that within the indigenous framework, the lands that were being defended were sacred or holy places. And people who are approaching from a secular perspective could maybe find solidarity around ecological concepts or anti-extraction concepts or anti-colonial concepts, but when there was lacking this reverence for the sacred or the holy, you would find that the solidarities didn't necessarily mesh, or they didn't match up, right? And I think that, you know, I also understand the Palestinian struggle as being an indigenous resistance, and especially so because the place that's being fought over is a holy land, right? Like we have to have some understanding or conception of what the holy is and how it functions. And I think that, you know, the dumbest takes on the war that's raging in the region right now is, you know, like I think the baseline media talking point is like, oh, it's, you know, what we're taught in school is it's a religious conflict over who has control over the Holy Land. Sure. Obviously, when we start to bring in more revolutionary or anti-colonial analysis, there's all of these historical materialist things that like have as much purchase, right? Like it's also a real estate speculation operation. It's also a natural resources extraction operation. There's geopolitical interests, and all of those are super important. And still, I think that if we dive deeper, there's almost a horseshoe where we return to religious concepts, right? Like there are more Christian Zionists actively like supporting the Zionist occupation entities' efforts in the region than there are living Jews on the face of the earth, right? By several orders of magnitude. And so I don't think that it is safe for us to reduce the West's investment in this like Pyrrhic, ultimately like doomed operation to just being about dollars and cents, right? And there is, I think we've all seen that there's a sadism in what the IOF does to the people of Gaza or in the West Bank that is irreducible to just monetary interests or just real estate speculation. And I think that it's important for us, if we're talking about actually opposing Zionism, to understand Zionism as a religious concept that is related to manifest destiny on this continent, or to the Nazi concept of Lebensraum, both of which are religious ideas that people have like a God ordained or, you know, Aryan alien ordained right to a certain piece of land, and that like their destiny is to completely conquer, dominate, extract from it. And I think that the things start to make more sense once we acknowledge that, like, you know, maybe the Western forces that are participating in this aren't actually trying to win, right? Maybe this isn't about whatever they say it is, of like the proliferation of liberal values or democracy or whatever their kind of like flimsy idea of geopolitical security is, but actually no, like the vast majority of, for example, Christian Zionists who support what Israel is doing want to unleash an apocalyptic hellfire there so that they can hasten the rapture and all get like lifted up and leave the rest of us to terrestrial hellfire. And I think that if we understand that, no, these people are like, this is part of their like biblically ordained vision of how the world ends. This is part of their eschatology. I think it challenges us to then have to come up with, well, what is a different vision of the end of the world? What is a different eschatology? Like, do we have another story of how things play out there other than just the unleashing of some sort of nuclear world war that eliminates all of us?
I appreciate that a lot, and it connects a little bit to we did a Sylvia Winter study group recently on like one of her pieces, and like I don't claim to understand everything that Sylvia Winter's talking about because she's like it's tough, you know.
She's deep. She's deep.
She's deep. But she has this adamant discussion within a lot of her work about how the secular is just this made up shit. Like that, you know, that like that we're all at that it is this kind of mask for Christianity, essentially. That what we think of when we're referencing the secular, you know, it comes out of the Enlightenment. It comes out of, and all of this was just to kind of put a new veneer on sort of Western hegemony, capitalism, colonialism, et cetera, et cetera, um, and patriarchy, you know, and um, I think about that a lot, you know, in terms of then, you know, I approach this as somebody, right, who grew up in the church, but who is not in the church and is I think I describe myself most often as agnostic because I'm just fine with that as like I don't fucking know, you know, but I don't, you know, I'm not a religious person. I'm not, you know, I don't go to church or anything like that um and yet I agree with what you just laid out, Julius, in terms of you can't, you know, it's not that helpful, honestly, especially a lot of the time to get people who get really high and mighty about our sort of secular leftism or whatever, like, you know, whether that's Marxism or anarchism, because they both have these long traditions of, you know, a move away actually from a lot of religious left traditions too that existed within in Europe as well. Um, so anyways, I appreciate that, you know, whether it's like, I guess in anarchism, it would be the sort of no gods, no masters kind of slogan that we often think about. Um, so Wendy, I don't know if you wanted to jump in there with anything else, but I can go to the next question.
Were we already talking about how watching other people respond?
Yeah, that would be, yeah, let's go there yet. Let me see if well, let me say something first. So yeah, let me just say this question. So um you know, within the Western left, you know, we're used to seeing that any act of kind of real courage or transgression of law or, you know, act of quote unquote violence, which might actually be violence or, you know, might be something that someone calls violence, you know, is going to be divisive among folks, you know, in the imperial core, whether they're anti-capitalists, you know, or not. Um, you know, there are always people, you know, who will call it like meaningless, right? Or stupid, or this is like a bad tactic. These are, you know, it's going to turn people against you, all of these things, right? Um, and, you know, in this case with Aaron, obviously, because you have to have a discussion that involves suicide, right? And anytime that we talk about suicide, there's a necessity, even kind of from I mean, the challenge is even on a legal grounds to some extent, like people have to sort of say, okay, I'm not trying to convince people to commit, you know, I'm not trying to uphold Aaron. What Aaron did is something that we should all do en masse, right? Um, because it is something that, I mean, we could talk about that, but there's such a again, I think this connects in some ways to spirituality, but also to secular. It's so pathologized, right? And there are religious discourses that pathologize it, and there are secular ones too. Um, and I think there's also this thing that Laura Shihai talked about yesterday, which is like as soon as it happened, then people mobilize mental health, right? So mental health actually becomes something that can be used to de-radicalize the act, to tell people to get treatment, to get care. He was not well. That's why he did this. It's not depoliticize, right? So that happens, right? And I think, again, thinking with Laura, who's someone who helps me a lot thinking about mental health, she would say, I believe, thinking of some of our prior conversations of like, if you're crazy, right? If you feel crazy right now, it means you're in touch with reality, right? If this is producing wild mental health effects for you, it means that you are aware of what is going on and how crazy it is, right? And you're in touch with that. And so don't let people just try to talk you out of those feelings, right? That affect, because it's so, it shows that you are connected and grounded actually. And there's also this discourse that gets mobilized, again, thinking about things, the way people respond, that's often said, and I mentioned to you before, Wendy, but it's like the true bravery is in living, right? Or the true, dying is not brave, right? The real bravery is to live for 40 years and to organize and to continue to do all of that, right? And so anyways, those are kind of the themes that I wanted, to pull up as we get into kind of how people responded and how you all thought about some of those responses.
Yeah, I saw all that online, especially. It's always interesting, because offline, I'm having conversations with friends, or maybe I'm not really paying attention to the timeline, and I'm like talking to you or something. So I'm having these conversations via text, in person, and it was a very familiar thing to me. Like, when I jumped on Twitter after we got the footage, we didn't know if he had passed away. Again, like, this was all developing. But I think once we knew that he did, and the video had come out, like, I think I posted Free Palestine, and it reminded me a lot of the responses I saw on Twitter specifically reminded me a lot of what I saw after the Al-Aqsa flood operation on October 7th, because I was getting texts. I got this text from a comrade that was like, it's a new day, and then like tells me what's going on. And I get online and I type in Free Palestine, and I'm expecting to like look at the timeline and see basically some version of that, over and over. And instead I see things that confuse me. And then I remember that that's how this is, but that, they're very different things. Obviously, like, there's connections, but like they're different times, different, events. But some of the responses were similar. Like, one of the first responses I saw on October 7th was this account being like, this is just going to make things worse for Palestinians, and it's about tactics, right? Like, it's as these tactics, and also focusing on the state response. And I remember that I replied to them saying, that's always a risk for anytime like oppressed peoples fight back against their oppressors in any way that actually threatens to overturn the conditions of that oppression. That's going to be a risk, but to use that as an argument against people doing things is never going to be on the side of liberation. Never. Like, you can count on that, and so I had that moment again, like seeing, some of people say that, like, not, and I had forgotten, because what's so dominant online right now too is just the way that people are talking about resistance. First of all, they talk about it as if it's just here. If they're in the US, they talk about just the resistance here. They don't tend to talk about an entire resistance going on elsewhere that is like, the level of like intensity is just way beyond anything I think most of us can even really relate to. Maybe not military people, but most of us, you know. So that's one of the ways they talk about it. And then when they talk about it here, everything is very focused on efficacy in this like very kind of short-sighted way, in my opinion, but very focused on what the government does, what the state does. So that response, like, you know, and immediately, and I don't blame people. It's so dominant online. I've even gotten sucked into it myself in my head at times. But this, you know, that's what I saw. A lot of what I saw was like just that assumption, people thinking that that's just the only way to think about resistance, you know? And then definitely seeing like all the stuff about mental health. I mean, it's very disconcerting because like you know, these moments make me realize that I have very different views on things like suicide and mental health than a lot of people do. I see those things as like legitimate decisions that people can make, you know, and I think that like, I honestly don't know anyone who cares about what the US is doing all over the world before now and now, you know, who doesn't have mental health issues. Like, how could you not, you know? I don't think I know anyone who I actually like. There's only people who there's people who deal more or less with their mental health issues, you know, but like, that's all I know. So, but I did observe those kinds of things. And I was most struck by how there was similarities for me, like witnessing this to October 7th. And this, you know, this kind of earth shattering to me, that in particular was like a paradigm shifting kind of moment and signified that paradigm shifting resistance was going to be on the table and liberation was going to be on the table. So in that way different, but you know, that here comes this young man who, you know, does something so big in solidarity with Palestinians. And yeah, you know, it wasn't in some way surprising to me that would be, people are scared of that, you know, so that didn't really surprise me. But I'll go ahead and let Julius talk about his, what he saw.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think there's already a horrible problem within revolutionary circles, which is that we feel like we need to like, and maybe this is the fault of social media, whatever, but I feel like there's this need that we always have to have the right take immediately. And I feel like there's so many people whose projects are just consistently commenting on whatever the news is and needing to always like keep the attention and keep putting out content. And, you know, when you're putting out content 2 times a day, like every single day on every issue that comes up, you're going to have a number of bad takes. And I think that a lot of the bad takes were really revealed after Aaron Bushnell's action. And I don't even really want to get into too many of them, but what I will say is that the one that really hasn't been thoroughly thought through or refuted yet, and what I think needs to be addressed, is this question of efficacy, right? And I think that people have this this surety that what Aaron did is ineffective. You know, there are more effective things, and I don't think that we can comfortably say that. Like, a lot of my early kind of like exposure to anarchist politics, and when I first was getting involved in things, it was the tail end of the anti-war movement around the Iraq War. And already then, you know, like, I'm glad you brought up Ed Mead talking about kind of the tame left and, you know, these actions in the Bay Area and whatever. Like, during the invasion of Iraq, we saw the biggest anti-war protests that this country has ever seen. And they had zero impact on stopping the United States from invading Iraq, right? Like, there was literally zero connection between, no causal connection between like the what people were doing on the ground here versus like any impediment towards the imperialist military operation. And I think that tendency is magnified and has been since October 7th, in that we have not seen any tactic And people have tried a number of things, right? Like every tactic that has been used in movements over the past several decades have all been brought back. They've all been citable. You know, we've had blockades, we've had disruptions, we've had clandestine attacks, we've had attacks on police and military infrastructure, on banks, we've had massive protests. And up until Aaron's suicide, there were zero responses from the state. And I don't think that our orientation should be towards the state or on trying to influence them. And yet, I think that we have to start from the perspective that up until that self-immolation, like the official policy of the regime was to not acknowledge that there was any resistance or protest to what was happening in Gaza, happening in the United States. And it's only been since Aaron's self-immolation that we've seen the Biden administration, for example, roll out what seems to be its next phase of response, which is now these like half-assed calls for a temporary ceasefire, or, you know, we're going to build this port or whatever. And obviously, like, all of that is insufficient. All of that is actually heinous and wrong. All of that is equally doomed to fail. So I don't think that we should say that any of those things are wins or concessions. They're not. But we can't deny the fact that this is the first thing that happened that has actually like forced a shift in the discourse, right? And obviously, I think that in resistance, we need much more material gains than that. But I think that the declarations that what Aaron did is ineffective were far premature. I also think that part of what makes what Aaron did so effective and charges it with so much potential is something that Wendy actually laid out in a poem that she wrote for Aaron, right? Which is that it was specifically important that Aaron was active duty when he did this. It was important that Aaron did this as an anarchist. And look, I am not saying and would not say that like all of us should go out and do this action en masse, right? Like if I, as like a lifelong criminal, decide that I'm going to go self-immolate, some people will care, and I love those people, but very few people will care about that, right? If any of us do this, we can very easily be written off as just, oh yeah, we're just crazy delinquents. And there was something singular about Aaron's positionality, who he was, what he represented, what he was wearing, what systems he was entrenched in, that made it so that what he did could not be ignored. And there's also something that about his action that really follows from what a coherent analysis of the US military regime is, right? That like ultimately what has to happen is for that regime to be destroyed, right? Like there is no liberatory vision for this planet that leaves the US military intact, right? And I think that given that his action entered into a situation where all of this, inspiring and unprecedented resistance that was happening here had zero impact on the military-industrial complex and on its operations and on its stated goals, we have to recognize that what he did was the first thing that actually like cracked the veneer, and all of a sudden someone within the military is acting, right? And if anarchist ideas, radical ideas, anti-Zionist struggle can reach within the military and be affecting people. And if people within the military, and Wendy cited like that we have a lot of history with anti-war vets who've done really, really inspiring and impressive things. That is the actual thing that would threaten the future viability of the military-industrial complex's unchallenged operation on this planet, is if people actually start to refuse from within it. And I think that there's something singular about the choice that Aaron made, and something extremely strategic. And so I think that those who are really quick, the armchair theorists who are really quick to say that, oh, this is unstrategic or this is ineffective, I just think those people are wrong and don't have enough information. And more so than whatever like paltry effects it has had on like shifting discourse within the West, to me, the real indicator of the efficacy is actually on the way that Aaron's self-immolation has been received by the resistance on the ground in the region. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, But I can't think of a single other act of solidarity that's been done by someone in the Imperial Center that has been acknowledged, commented on, and like honored and uplifted by the resistance on the ground in Palestine. You know, we had the PFLP and Hamas both release statements about it. The Houthis obviously like had massive demonstrations, like had declared Aaron a martyr of humanity. So to me, the fact that something that someone in the Imperial Center did is resonating with the actual like resistance, and the only people who are doing anything materially to resist what is happening, that speaks to a type of efficacy in terms of communication between resistance forces on different continents. And I think that that can't be overlooked, and the potential that's in that is huge. And the fact that he's an anarchist and that like he did this as an anarchist, it there's just a lot of potential there for other anarchists to think about like how we're communicating and moving in solidarity with these resistance forces that aren't anarchist, but with whom we share common goals.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I would say just quickly as like a slight correction. I mean, it's not the only time that Hamas or PFLP or other resistance factions have acknowledged protests or resistance in other parts of the world. They've actually, from the beginning, in a lot of their communiques, spoken about that, like saying, but they've always done it in very general terms and just sort of saying, like, you know, we appreciate people who are protesting, marching, lifting their voices, etc. Um, and they will say, you know, within the United States, within, you know, they don't use the United States, of course, 'cause they shouldn't. But anyway, but the difference that you're touching on is a real one, which is that certainly they have not, you know, uplifted any individual or any specific act that has been taken and really, um, you know, honored it, paid homage to it, you know, recognized the power of it, the sacrifice, etc. Put his face on, you know, placards and taken it out in marches and things like that, as we've seen in Yemen. And so I agree with the kind of the general point you're making, and I think it connects to what you're saying about efficacy. I mean, I think, you know, um, this question of like, it's often this question of, is it effective? And I actually think there's an important, like, I would like to pose the question of, is it affective almost like, because it, I think an act like that has the power to change people, you know, and I'm not saying it's gonna change Joe Biden or, you know, the Pentagon or something like that, but, you know, it has an impact, I think, on other service members. I mean, to your point, Julius, it was the first time that I'm aware of that, you know, actual Pentagon officials had to, like, speak to, like, what's the climate of morale within the US military right now that things like this are happening. Um, and um, so yeah, and I do think the point you're making too about, you know, this new strategy that Biden and Harris are using, in terms of saying, well, now we support a temporary ceasefire, you know, now we want to get aid in, and Israel's stopping us from getting aid in, so we need to build this pier, etc., is certainly not a win, but it is a sign that they're feeling pressure, right? And so it, to me, it's like that means we need to put more pressure on, not less, not take it as a win and back away, but say like, okay, they're starting to feel it a little bit. And so yeah, I totally agree. I was really frustrated by that discussion of efficacy, because it's like, you know, what do people think is happening that's changing things? You know, like, what do people think is going on right now? I mean, the most effective resistance is being put on in the region, right? It is what Ansar Allah is doing to stop boats for ships from going through the canal there. Like, it is what the Palestinian resistance is doing. It is what Hezbollah is doing too on the northern front. Like, those are the things that are most effective from a material standpoint. Um, and yet from our vantage point, we can say like, I don't know that you can point to anything else that has been done in the United States at all that had that level of international, required that level of response and had that kind of impact on people, in the United States and around the world. So I think it's very effective in that way. It doesn't mean that it's going to stop the genocide as an individual act, but I think I agree with what you're laying out there. So yeah, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing too, that the one of the responses to what Aaron Bushnell did was there has been like a statement. I don't know if you saw that put out by like active duty military that was like criticizing the IDF, and like this analysis, obviously, like I don't like it or whatever, but I think people miss the point of it when they focus on that. Like, it's important that there be dissension in the ranks, and it's important. I mean, people need to keep in mind that it's actually like illegal for them to be expressing political opinions, so like that's actually a big deal. Like, we don't have to be on board with them, we don't have to agree or anything like that, but dissension in the ranks, people willing to do things that are illegal, to actually say something against what's happening in Palestine is important. It's good. We don't know where that's going to go, all of that. But again, kind of going back to this thing about efficacy, no one knew that Aaron Bushnell was going to walk up to the Israeli embassy in DC and do what he did. No one knew that. No one knew that. And in terms of the impact, there are things we cannot know in advance. Like we're going to have to see. But like, this definitely is powerful, and it has the capacity to start things that will also result in things that are just as like, oh my God, as that moment. And people need to be more comfortable with this. And it sucks, right? Because like, these things our world is what it is, and it's not a place that we want to live in, but like, this is how resistance works. And I guess, that's a really important point that I hope we continue to drive home throughout this, is that there are things we can't know in advance, and there is like some faith involved here. I'm not a religious person, I'm not even that spiritual, like, but I do have, and I think about it all the time when it comes to struggle, when it comes to resistance. Yeah, I'm here because there is some faith that I have. Like, I don't think I'd be doing any of this stuff if I didn't believe that a revolution was possible in my lifetime. I actually believe that. I don't know it, but I have faith that that is a possibility, and I don't want to leave and not be around for that, but yeah, the one more thing I wanted to say too is, yeah, the part of the discussion online that I saw that was kind of interesting to me is people grappling with him being an active duty airman, and because that it was really important to this, and I saw people basically, it's Twitter, just like focusing so much on his identity, but not enough in some ways, like in relation to the act, like not understanding that like whatever he was, we could go back and forth. And I personally, like, we've had these discussions over the last, like, among anarchists over the last like 3-4 years, yeah, about whether, somebody in the military is like, you can be an anarchist in the military. It's been a discussion, and I've come down on the side, like, I don't think that means anything really. It's just a word if like you're in, a state military and, that's your little patch or whatever. But whatever he was before he died an anarchist, like, I mean, the most anarchist I've ever seen, like that's how he died. And that was the point. His identity and his action, like all of this was part of why he did that, why it was so powerful, and why he's an anarchist.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I mean, it connects to something. There's very difficult conversations, I think, along the left a lot of times around how to relate to people that are in the military, how to relate to former military folks. And I think unfortunately, like that this is a little bit too much of a kind of, um, in my view, a little bit too much of kind of an identity politic discussion, a little bit an identitarian one, where we think about the military as somebody's politics, as their identity. And obviously it's true that while you're in it, like you are just a weapon in the machinery of empire. And like I have like you, Wendy, I have military folks in my family, and I can't stand them. And their politics are absolutely abhorrent, right? But I also do think, and I know this gets into the question of like the difference between an imperial military versus like, military in other countries and things like that. But I do think when you look at the kind of contradictions that have to change over time to produce meaningful change, to produce revolutions, etc., it does always usually involve some level of internal dissent within military, some level of factions and things like that. And so again, like I'm with you of like, are the things that we see at this point something where we're like, oh, I'm gonna go form an alliance and try to do this, like, or where I agree with the politics of these people? No. But at the same time, I think it's good that those things are happening. I think it's good that like that an Aaron Bushnell could be produced from within the US military, says something about where we are at this stage of, you know, where the world is, the decline of empire in certain ways, and being able to see the egregious acts that the US military is involved in and being revolted by them, and deepening people's politics. I think those are generally good things. I would love to see a lot more of that than what we see currently. But it does offer up a little bit. I mean, there's some stuff people have raised in the chat that I do want to get to, of sort of, maybe I'll pull it up now actually, because it's a good question. But not criticizing what Aaron Bushnell did, but more of people's response. Is it because he was a white male in the military that causes them to at least be aware of what's going on, or because he televised it? And I think that both of those things all of that is very important, I think, to why people are responding the way they are, especially I do believe because there's a film. Because I wholly believe that if it wasn't if people weren't able to see it, then it would have gotten no coverage, or maybe like a little, footnote in some article that wouldn't have even acknowledged the politics of why this was done. And so I do think, from my vantage point, that's probably the most important aspect, is because people could see it and hear from him. But I also think that absolutely the white maleness, the militariness, those things matter. So I don't know if you all want to say anything about those aspects.
Yeah, I mean, there was another immolation in Atlanta. Yes. Where a woman self-immolated, like as part of this same struggle, and her action has been completely swept under the rug. She's still alive, by the way, and at Grady Hospital in Atlanta, and there's been a complete erasure of what she did. No one talks about the politics of it. And so there is this kind of depoliticization that happens. And I think that, again, to both what the commenter is saying and to the point that Wendy's poem raised, there was something really specific about who Aaron was. And I think that there is, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought, but what you were saying about like affective versus effective feels important, right? Like there was a powerful affect to what Aaron did. And at least looking at some of the responses since then, the one that resonated with me the most and the affect of which caught me the most and I felt most moved by was actually the demonstration that happened in Portland, where a bunch of anti-war vets were burning their uniforms and chanting, "Aaron Bushnell, you are not alone." And then each of them would go up and burn their like military outfit. And I think that felt like really powerful and shows, like, beyond just the statement that Wendy cited, it shows that there is growing dissension within the military. And Wendy, brought up that the reason she does what she does is because she believes that revolution in our lifetime is possible. I maybe have like a slightly more pessimistic view. I do think revolution is possible, but I think that if it were to happen, it would be an absolute fucking miracle at this point. And I don't think it will happen as a direct causal relation from anything that pro-revolutionaries in the United States are doing, right? Like if we're actually talking about what a revolution would have to look like in this country, in the West, globally, revolution would be all of us, everyone, not just anarchists, not just communists, not just Islamists, but revolution would have to be everyone refusing the roles that they play within this society, right? And like negating who they are and what functions they play. It would mean military people refusing to be military, cops refusing to be cops, store clerks refusing to be store clerks. And I think that on an affective level, what Aaron did was like a distilled microcosm of that type of refusal, right? Which isn't to say that the only thing that active duty military people can do is self-immolate. There's a lot that they can do. There's a long arc of history of what active duty military people have done to resist the existence of the military or resist the function of the military in revolutionary situations. And it's somewhat beyond the scope of this conversation to really get into or detail all of that. But I think that what on a just basic primal affective level, what Aaron did is the type of or the intensity of self-refusal and self-negation that I think would have to occur on a widespread level for there to be revolution in our lifetime.
Yeah, appreciate that. I just want to respond to this too. I mean, yeah, I do think that it is very telling that it does take someone like Aaron to do this to impact some people. I mean, I think everybody here was profoundly impacted a very months and months ago and probably years ago by the Palestinian struggle, right? Um and so, it it's an unfortunate reality of just kind of where a lot of people are, that people dying, black and brown people dying, around the world and in the United States too, does not register for them in the same way, Yeah, Wendy, you came
Well,
off
I was
mic.
going to
Did you want
say,
to
I
comment?
mean, yeah, I think my response to that too is that Aaron Bushnell felt the same way, like about the lack of care. And I think what's so profound and implicit in what he did is that underneath that, there's this implicit argument he's making about the sacredness of his life in relation to the sacredness of Palestinian lives. And what he's saying is it's no more sacred, and that I think that's very like, yes, that's going to get a lot of people's attention in the US who don't want to think like that, or they can't sit with it, so he understood that deeply, I believe. I can't say for sure, but like what's implicit in that act is very much knowing that Palestinians are not valued, that they are being treated as disposable, and this is someone who hated that, and like he even said, this thing that I'm doing, it's an extreme act of protest, but given what Palestinians are suffering in Palestine at the hands of their colonizers, this isn't that extreme at all. He meant it, and I think so. Those kinds of things, when people say that, I'm like, you completely miss the point of this. Like, this is part of why he did what he did, because he saw that too, and people, like, by what he did, people aren't just paying attention to him. They're paying attention to Palestine. They're paying attention to Palestinians. That level of resistance is actually being given more ground to breathe here in the States because of what he did. Because if you're saying that, like, their lives are that important, then why shouldn't they be able to fight for them? Why shouldn't they be able to, like, brave death for them the way he was?
Yeah, and I mean, just circling back a little bit to the bad responses and the bad takes that issued within the first day, I think that one of the worst was people who acknowledged that this type of tactic or this type of action could have a role in a movement, but should be absolutely reserved for the worst case scenario, for when all other things have been exhausted, right? Like this should be a last resort. And yeah, from the perspective of someone in the West who maybe isn't doing that much with their life or not helping that much with the resistance struggle, sure, you could imagine that this was not a last resort. Maybe there were other things that could have been done. But if we situate it within the struggle of how many people in Palestine have died, have been martyred already, and accept that, like, how much more dire can things get before people start taking last resorts type actions, right? Like, I think that if we are unwilling to normalize or accept the mass death of people in Palestine, if we are unwilling to accept that, like, these deaths just function as part of the operation of capitalism and that we can take them for granted, if we hold Aaron's action in the fullness of how devastating what has happened is, then yeah, like, I believe that we've crossed that threshold, right? Like, I believe that we're in last resort territory. Like, it's now or never for people to take the type of actions that they imagine themselves capable of taking.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, and I think we talked about it a little bit. I can't remember where I read this, but there's a discussion, there's like a kind of anti-capitalist discussion. I wish I read it. I'm so bad because like I always want to cite people and then I forget who said these things and then I can't cite them. But someone very brilliant whose name I am forgetting had discussed about, you know, suicide itself as anti-capitalist to some degree, right? Even, I mean, and again, I'm not saying like everybody, but because it's a rejection of, the system itself, right? And our own role within the system, having our reproduction, again, it goes against the reproduction of the system, and it goes against, obviously our surplus value can't be extracted, et cetera, et cetera. But if you think about that in Aaron's case, right, it's a profoundly anti-imperialist act to take, because you are literally on a personal level, you're literally sabotaging, military equipment and, machinery and intelligence. But it's, I mean, you just kind of follow, and so I think Lara had talked about sort of all of us with our critiques and our criticisms and our outright rejection, right, of US militarism, you know, this is an embodiment of that, right? What Aaron did. And so I think, to dishonor that also in some ways becomes a kind of dishonoring of our own politics in certain ways. Um, so let's talk a little bit about, why, and we've touched on this along the way, so I don't know how much more you want to offer on it, but the importance for each of you that Aaron was an anarchist, and Wendy, you've already mentioned the resonances of South Texas for the two of you, but how did you all process those things from a perspective of being anarchists and thinking about this? It's been interesting that as Julius already said, as Wendy, I think you said as well, that like he's been lifted up around the world by many people who are not, so it's not as though that folks, can't lift him up or whatever because they're not anarchists. But what has it meant for each of you in that vein?
Um, well, something that we've talked about a little bit, me and some friends mostly, but one of the really amazing things about this is that when I came into anarchism and like anti-state communism here in the Bay Area, the struggle for free Palestine is something that is very valued, and we have Muslim comrades. It's very valued, and it's expected, but I actually don't think that a lot of people know how important the resistance for a free Palestine, the struggle for a free Palestine, Palestinian solidarity is for anarchists. Like I don't think that a lot of people were aware of that. I'm sometimes with my experience in the Bay, it seems very different than a lot of other places, you know, because it is like pretty mixed, the kinds of people that are here, you know. And so what ends up being very important is basically like who's going to go hard. And that, I mean, and so that's a particular movement that people go hard for here, you know, and, but I don't think a lot of people associate that with anarchism. And I'm actually just so grateful that, like, I think it's clarifying for people where they might have not been clear before at how important it is to a lot of anarchists. Like, it's integral to liberation overall. You know, like that's seen as like a very important struggle to like the total one, you know. And another thing, I'm like looking at my notes because I want to be sure I get this right. What meant a lot to me too, he was an anarchist, but also that he went so out of his way. I mean, this person, he plans so well. And even when you plan so well, like sometimes things go badly, you know, but like he plans so well, you know, and the amount of like work and effort and attention to detail that he brought to this is, I think, incredible. And just so like, this is a clear-eyed person, you know, like, and that's not to say like not mentally ill, like I don't care about any of that, you know, that's not what I'm saying. I just, this person knew what he was doing. And it means so much that he like went out of his way to make sure that anarchism was attached to it. Also because the amount of trust that demonstrates, you know, in anarchists, you know, like actually believing that like anarchists would hold him down, you know, like anarchists would like make sure that this got spread, but not just that, like not anarchists just that he sent these things to. I'm talking about anarchists, you know, that they would hold him down and that they would act in solidarity with him and in solidarity with Palestinians. You know, like this was definitely, there was a lot of trust that was demonstrated there. And what I put here, just because I was like going off, but like, you know, what faith in anarchism, what faith in what anarchism is capable of, what faith in what anarchism can do for decolonial struggle. What a beautiful vision he had for anarchism. And it's not just his, and I believe he knew that, you know, so I get a little weepy.
It's all right.
But yeah, I'm going to just let Julius go now.
Yeah, I mean, domestically, like for here, I think there's huge implications for anarchism as a tradition. You know, some of the most inspiring acts of solidarity to me have been claimed by anarchists who are foregrounding their faith, right? Like in the Bay Area, we've seen really cool joint actions claimed by Muslim anarchists alongside anti-Zionist Jewish anarchists. And I think that it's undeniable that the no gods, no masters hegemony of like a secular form of anarchism is not actually totalizing, and that like doesn't fully encompass the range of anarchist positions that exist. And I'm not Muslim or Jewish, but I really value the contributions that my Muslim and Jewish comrades have brought to this conflict and to this struggle, especially when they're foregrounding their religiosity, right? And like why that causes them to move. And obviously we don't have any indicators that Aaron was moved by a particularly religious sentiment, but I think that it shows that anarchism is changing and evolving to adapt to new situations that the anarcho-atheism of the last few centuries maybe is not able to respond to. I also think that there is the fact that someone who is in the US military got radicalized in the way that Aaron did, right? And it seems that the way he got radicalized by his own account was through watching YouTube channels, listening to podcasts. Like he seemed to have been a very active person on the internet. And it shows that, I think it demonstrates to anarchists the strength of our ideas, that like someone who is like in the heart of like the military industrial complex could hear these ideas, and these ideas would change the course of their life. make them completely rethink what they're doing and ultimately decide to give their everything to a struggle. And I think that charges those who put out anarchist theory, anarchist analysis, whatever. Like, I think it gives us a greater responsibility to actually understand that the things we're saying have reach beyond just our limited scene subcultures, like local organizing operations, whatever. I think that when we widen our view beyond just the states, I think that there's also implications for anarchism globally that are tied up in what Aaron did. One of the things that I was following in the first few months after Al-Aqsa flood was the activity and the statements and then the subsequent controversy around Fauda, or the anarchist youth movement that has been announcing itself primarily out of the West Bank. And there was like a controversy where anarchists associated with the website Autonom had basically put out this statement saying that they didn't believe that Fauda existed, that it was maybe a Mossad honey trap, that it was some sort of like operation. And I think that, if I'm being generous, the reason that some anarchists in the West signed on to this, specifically like the old guard anarchists, older generations, is that they didn't know anyone who on the ground could personally verify that this group existed, right? And I think that disconnect is largely maybe a generational divide. Like, of course, like Gen X Israeli anarchists may not know the like 19-year-old Palestinian youths who are like taking up and like engaging in street fighting and like having anarchism be their motivating factor, right? And so I think that for some people there was this unthinkability that there could be a Palestinian anarchism that would be like active on the ground. And I think that if that was unthinkable a few months ago, in a context now where like the person who is like a Westerner who has had now like the greatest impact internationally in terms of like recognition and sacrifice is someone who's an anarchist, I think that it changes the conversation a little bit. I have less generous views of why some people were against the existence of something like Fauda as well. Like, when you look at the Twitter accounts or the kind of anarchist media outlets that were primarily circulating the conspiracy theory that Fauda didn't exist or was Mossad, these are primarily people who had said nothing about Palestine since October 7th, like not a single word. And these are also people who have, in other cases, demonstrated, frankly, Islamophobic opinions about the resistance in the region. And one of the things that I think is most telling is that the denunciation of Fauda came out immediately after at the time, the most recent statement from the group detailed how they had met with Hamas and like gotten approval from Hamas for their operations, and that they were participating in the kind of like joint room strategizing and operations of the broader resistance axis. And so I think for people whose anarchism refuses to like hold space for Islamic resistance, like it would be, of course, something that they would need to denounce if there are anarchists in the region who are being like, no, like these are our comrades, we're like fighting in like a joint operation with them. And so to me, I think it's way too early to make any sort of like predictions or prognostications of like what Aaron's action means for anarchism in the region. But what I can say is that like anarchism has been, in the last few years, especially among youth, a growing movement in the Arab-speaking world, in the region more generally. And I look forward to seeing how it continues to develop. And I think that as an anarchist in the West, it's important to stay abreast of and in solidarity with those things.
Right on. Appreciate that. So let's move to. So I had two questions here, and I'll kind of just ask them together. One was, what do we think people are disavowing when they disavow Aaron Bushnell? So, I guess this is in some ways trying to psychoanalyze or whatever people who are, are engaged in this politics of disavowing. But also like, and feel free to take up whichever part of this you most want to talk about. How do we think about honoring a sacrifice like this? Like, do sacrifices like Aaron's, you know, do they help sustain us? What is our relationship to these kinds of sacrifices for the two of you?
Um, so I'll start with what I think they're disavowing. And I wrote something down just like maybe to make this shorter. I don't know how we are in time. But so I said, one thing I believe people are disavowing when they disavow Aaron is resistance that braves death in pursuit of a free Palestine. I think some people might be disavowing suicide, however wrong that characterization of Aaron's act is. But I think more are disavowing choosing death, though he couldn't have known for sure that he would die in the face of genocide. It's scary. And what Aaron did suggest, he saw his life as no more sacred than the lives of people being martyred in Palestine. I think that's a real hard thing to come to or think about for too long. So some people would rather disavow it altogether. So that's one thing I think. And in general, I think people who demonstrate the level of commitment to liberatory struggle that Aaron Bushnell demonstrated through his actions, like they scare most people. These people scare most people, and they'll try very hard to pretend they don't even exist, you know. And when they're forced to witness those people in action, they'll try to discredit them. People are very scared of this, and I know that there's the self-immolation, but I've seen it in other instances too, when people take, Michael Reinl, von Spronson, like there's these moments that have come where people take actions that most people wouldn't. I even see it in the streets. Like if somebody just kind of, strays from the script, the like people are really terrified of like real disruption, and so I can't help but think like seeing this, it was upsetting to me because I've witnessed in person again and again people refusing to like even share space, let alone cultivate space for people willing to sacrifice and risk a lot. I've seen that over and over again over 13 years, and I've also been lucky enough to have not seen it sometimes, but I've seen that disavowal of these people again and again. And it was so upsetting that this was just like, you can't even hold space in your memory, like not even in your memory. You can't just sit with someone actually being this committed, that's upsetting. But I feel like the disavowal has a lot to do with all these things, not just about what he actually did, and in terms of sacrifice, like I actually want Julius to get into that way more, because I think that he understands something about that it's hard for me to completely understand, but I do think in Aaron's case, like he left a will, he left an actual will about what he wanted. And I'm not going to get into it, but I personally haven't even said R.I.P. Aaron Bushnell, and part of why that I haven't is because I don't think he's resting, like what was said in that will, there's not a place for him in this earth, and the world has to completely change so that he can rest. But there's a role that we all have to play in that. Like Palestinians will ultimately decide whether his ashes will be spread in a free Palestine, but we have a role in getting him there too. And that's, to me, like that's how we honor him.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in terms of like how we honor this sacrifice that we could get into. Like, I think that obviously the Houthis and the Palestinians have demonstrated like how they honor the sacrifice. I think that it is left for us to still figure out what it means here and how we honor it. But what I'll say is that sacrifice, and in this, I'm like a huge George Bataille nerd. I have been very influenced by his ideas on sacrifice, and one of the understandings that I've come to is that sacrifice it's like a foundational part of any human social formation. right? Like just even on a biological level, right? Like in order for us to survive, some things must die and must be turned into energy that we consume, right? And I think that there is a need to understand that, like, regardless of what we think about sacrifice, what we think about this action, there's something about this type of act that resonates, like, for us on a very ancient and primal level. And I think that we, in talking about in the present, being in solidarity with movements where martyrdom is a motivating factor, right? Where the martyrs are a force in the present that people can engage with and that are inspiring and what people fight for. That already gives us like a framework for how to understand our relationship to the dead. But I don't think it's the only framework we can have. And I think that part of the problem of like Western secular stuff is that our conception of, for example, the concept of heroism is really tainted by both capitalism and Marvel and whatever. That like a hero is someone who does something good, or a hero is a good person, or a hero is someone who whatever has in one way or another like allied themselves with the forces of morality against evil. And if we look at a more ancient conception of heroism, that's not the case. Like a hero in the like strictly classical sense is someone who after their death continued to have an impact among the living and like caused supernatural or whatever occurrences to happen, right? Like heroes were spirits that were haunting a particular place, maybe the place that they died or the place that they were from. And people would develop hero cultists as not a means of saying like this person is particularly good, but instead of saying this person through their actions in their life was particularly impactful and continues to affect us, and we need to appease them so that they like chill out, right? And this is a bit of an aside, but one of the kind of rabbit holes I've fell down since El Aqsa flood has been looking into some of the like very ancient like religious traditions in Gaza specifically. And a lot of people don't know this, but during the Christianization of the Roman Empire, Gaza was actually one of the last holdouts of paganism. And people may remember that early on, the IOF bombed St. Porphyrius Church, and St. Porphyrius was the one who Christianized Gaza, and he did so by destroying the last remaining 8 pagan temples in Gaza, and one of them was to the heroes of Gaza. And so this idea of heroism as a way of relating to the dead, who in particular had a strong impact on a place, goes back in the region like thousands of years prior to the particular, like maybe the Muslim framing of what martyrdom looks like. And so I think that there's a lot of examples of what it means historically for someone who died doing something particularly noteworthy or tremendous and how we engage with them. But I think that the thing that Wendy mentions about memory is actually the most important, right? Like how we remember. And I think that action in Portland where the vets burn their uniforms, that to me strikes of a way of keeping Aaron's memory active in the present, not just alive. Like he continues, and I agree that he's not resting. He continues to have impact on what people are doing. And I think that it really remains to be seen just how far going that impact is.
I really appreciate both of you. That was great. This is related. I don't know. You might have some more things to say about this. I mean, Wendy, this is something that I've always appreciated the way that you've talked about, and you've kind of talked about it a little bit in this discussion as well. But what do you talked about it in some ways in relation to that last response of, what are people disavowing, and so I'm curious if either of you could say, or both of you could say a little bit more about, a healthy relationship to risk taking, to sacrifice, to the transgression of laws and boundaries, and how do we cultivate that within a culture of resistance, and maybe just say it from practices that you all have seen that you hold or whatever.
Well, I'll go back to my first time at a demo, and like I said, showing up in a cardigan and light, like ridiculous. Like I still, I can't, how could I ever forget what I was wearing because it was so dumb, you know? But just like not knowing what I was getting into at all. Like I didn't, you know, and I feel like there's been a lot of times like that. But for me, you know, uh, it was a very militant demo, you know, and it was like, it kind of, I'm sad for people who've never gotten to experience that. I really am. I think that it is an amazing thing to see people. As a friend recently, an anarchist friend recently said, you know, it's inspiring to see people take themselves so seriously, you know, and it is for me, you know, and I didn't know what I was getting into, and I got arrested that day, you know, and then I know a lot of other stuff happened, but like I wasn't mad about that. I was actually just like I couldn't believe um that I was seeing people act in these ways, act against the city for what, you know, for what had just happened to this young man who was killed, you know, young Black man that was killed. Uh I think that like I don't know. It's helpful for me. Like I am always scared when I go to these things, you know, and I think most people I know are scared when they go to these things. I think acknowledging this fear is actually a really important part of, you know, I don't know about health. The like healthy is good. I actually think that we should actually say healthy and distinguish that from safe. You know, like healthy is not like safe is not always healthy. You know, so anyways, but like, you know, I think like acknowledging that fear is a healthy thing to do. Like you're gonna have this fear, right? It's scary. And I think accepting that you can't know exactly what's gonna happen at any of these demos is an important thing to actually always have in your mind too. Like I think about how um, you know, a lot can happen at these demos that you just didn't anticipate. I, for some reason, Kent State is always in my head, you know, like just these random, like you don't know, we don't know. So you're taking a risk every time you go out there. You know, it's true. Um, and maybe I'm saying that so that we can get into a context of like, this is a dangerous thing that we're all doing, you know, and why would you take this risk to begin with? Oh, because there's something really important that you feel like you need to do something about, right? And so, given that, given the already danger, given why you're here taking these risks, like having room, making space for people that are and cultivating that space, because honestly, like a lot of times this will be like put, you know, you'll have a militant demo, you'll have like an uprising, a riot or whatever, and the people will blame the white anarchists. As someone who's been there a lot of times, like it's that's not true. Like I mean, large, like yes, anarchists are involved in those kinds of things, but like what anarchists are really good at, what I've always appreciated about anarchists, is the way that they can cultivate space and hold space for young Black, brown, like basically unaffiliated often, but you know, people that are, they're fed up, you know, and keeping space for those people is important. They are important to these struggles, and it makes me sad how like it seems like a lot of people don't really believe that, but they are incredibly important. All of these people are incredibly important to struggle. There are lots of things that I did not know I was capable of that I have done because I have been around these people and I care about these people and I actually value them. They bring out the best in us. You know, they do. And I just wish that people would not be so focused on like basically like their safety, that they would be so ready to just get rid of these people because we don't have anything without them.
Yeah, I think that the question of risk aversion is a big one for anarchists, and I think we've already named early on in the conversation some of the factors that are going on. I think that the way identity politics works has like really kind of warped a lot of people's thinking about risk and like who is taking risks and like what exactly they're risking. I think that COVID was a moment that I saw like a shift, and this is a total aside, maybe not worth getting into, but I do think that the COVID moment gave us like a movement, or it shifted where people conceive of risk, and like I think we saw a risk aversion deepen and settle into leftist and revolutionary circles. I guess what I want to say for people listening is that taking more effective or more militant or more impactful action doesn't necessarily need to mean that those actions are more risky. Potentially, if you get caught, but there's a type of intelligence to carrying out a clandestine attack, to carrying out some active sabotage that actually could make it less risky than just attending a demonstration where you might get doxxed or skunk gassed or shot with a nail gun by a Zionist or run over by some psychopath in their car. Like just because something is like not particularly militant or effective doesn't mean that it's not risky, right? And I think that we live in a world now where like the different risk profiles that we take they're just not super straightforward or linear. And I think that people can do things that could be very impactful, even potentially very visible, and still take measures to mitigate whatever risks they could be doing. I think that the question of risk also goes back to what I brought up early on about our definition or our understanding of sacrifice and where it comes from, right? Like if sacrifice is something we're willing to give up to make it sacred, then to a certain sense, the question of risk is a personal question for each of us of what are we willing to give up? What are we willing to potentially risk? Is it our professional careers? Is it our freedom? Is it our very bodily survival? And I think that that is a personal question that all of us have to sort through and develop our own risk profile. Aaron's action obviously gives us one example of what one person can give up and the type of impact that it has. I think that those of us who are in different positions and in different situations can come up with different answers to that question. And it's not just something that we sort through alone and personally, though it starts there. But for me, what I think is more powerful is, okay, if we know what one person can risk and what the potential impact could be, then what can 3 of us risk together? What can 4 of us risk together? What can a group of 7 people who is committed to ongoing resistance, doing as much as they can in the time that they're allotted here on Earth, like what can they come up with? And I think that every person, every affinity group, every organization is going to come to different places and come to different answers to that question. And it would be wrong of me or Wendy to sit here and tell people what their risk threshold should be. But what I would encourage is for everyone to have a real and honest conversation, first with themselves and then with their closest comrades, about what are they willing to put on the line, especially in light of the fact that there are some people who are putting everything on the line.
Absolutely. Really appreciate that. Really appreciate all of your reflections today. I'm going to share some things that some folks have said along the way in the chat. One, I'll just say, Wendy, you got a lot of hearts along the way. Um, but also, if folks do have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. And we do have a little time, so I can ask 1 or 2 if folks do. So Sammy K, this was earlier on, but it resonates with what you just said, Julius. Given that we're in Ramadan right now, it's important to make this distinction between sacrifice and compromise. And I think that that's, again, to think about the making sacred aspect of it as well. Aquia says, sometimes people look at me weird when I say this, but keeping in mind that I could always exit this earth is reassuring to me that I always have choices. I brought this up in part because it's also something that Laura talked about yesterday in our conversation about that, there's all these discussions about bodily autonomy and autonomy, right? And like you to say to people that they don't have that choice is a rejection of the idea that people have autonomy over their very themselves, right? So yeah. Wendy's poetry is so powerful. We love her work. I won't try to do the Spanish because I'll butcher it, but Palestine will be free, I get, and struggle will continue and solidarity, so yeah. Um, uh, I appreciated this remark. So far I've witnessed this act, meaning Aaron's act of self-immolation, drawing people closer, wanting to work harder, do more. Maybe that includes taking more risks. I mean, it certainly has brought a lot of people, a lot of energy back out in new ways that I've seen. Wendy, you came off mute. Do you want to say something?
Hi, Oki. I love Oki. So it's just I had to say hi.
I love Oki too.
Yeah.
Right on. Brooke and Hakan had a couple of things to say here. Shout out to Brooke. We know Brooke.
Hi,
A
Brooke.
major fact. So a major factor in the Vietnamese victory was the U.S. forces not being able to rely on field orders being followed by mutinying or disobedient troops. Yes, I mean, I think this is an important recognition of, again, something that would be a broader conversation, but what Julius was talking about earlier, in terms of, there's a lot of things that people in the military can do, and you brought it up as well, Wendy, and those are serious things and they will be met with serious consequences, but there are a lot of things that people can do to resist from within the military too. And then this conversation was just to highlight that there's this documentary, Sir No Sir, about dissent during Vietnam. I haven't seen this, but it sounds really interesting. It's a sabotage, not letting arms shipments, throwing grenades in officers' quarters are good things. um, all right. And then this is something to, of course, the difference between revolutionary and reactionary suicide that Huey P. Newton discussed in his work. Let's see. So let me see if there's anything here. Stevie said, I really think that's part of the question. Aaron's actions demand we ask ourselves and each other, what are we willing to risk? Um, all right. All right. I think that's it. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for your comments and for joining us for this beautiful discussion. Wendy and Julius, is there anything that either of you want to say in closing?
Free Palestine, long live anarchy, love to all the comrades.
Yes, free Palestine. And love to all the comrades, all of them.
Right on. All right, y'all. I'm going to take us out of here. Thank you again. We will be back tomorrow with Steven Saleta. So look forward to that as well. Thanks.